Dawn lifts over Somerton Beach as gulls wheel, and the tide gnaws at the sand, and Eleanor Ward said, "Start where the body lies and the lies begin." She kneels beside the stranger whose shoes are polished like a final alibi, and Detective Thomas Reed said, "No wallet, no marks, neat as a ledger." The sea whispers in the hollow between questions, while a tram bell rings inland. Hey, whoa, whoa, whoa. A nurse on holiday stares and then looks away as if the sight might stain her future. Eleanor studies the gray suit, the stitched labels cut clean, and she said someone wanted him nameless. Reed signals the constable to widen the cordon, as the first reporters drift like sharks. The coroner's van idles, ticking in the cool air. Eleanor feels the chill settle into her bones, and she said, if he carried a secret, it is somewhere small enough to hide yet heavy enough to drown a man. The wind lifts the man's tie like a semaphore no one can read. By mid-morning the beach is a map of footprints that mean nothing, and Eleanor Ward said, absence is the loudest evidence. Reed walks the perimeter and said, we keep it quiet until we know what we have. The coroner seals the body while the witness breathes into her hands, and a cloud pulls the light thin as paper. Eleanor marks the cut labels and the immaculate shoes, feeling the craft of erasure. The constable pockets a cigarette he never lights. Waves erase the first outline, and then the second, as if the sea corrects the record. Eleanor studies the tram timetable and said, he arrived to vanish. Reed speaks to the press with a measured voice that promises nothing and gives less. The nurse's eyes follow the van as it leaves, and the siren remains mercifully unlit. Eleanor turns a page and the sand sticks to the ink. At the station evidence sits under a humming light that flatters nothing, and Eleanor Ward said, clothes without names are names waiting to be found. Reed rolls a suitcase onto the table and said, left at the baths, checked with care. Dr. Hale opens the property list while dust motes drift like tired snowfall. There are garments with odd stitches and a sharpened comb, and a thread card that does not match local stock. Eleanor traces a seam and said, someone cut every origin away, but left the craft. Reed nods toward the labels and said, every trail trimmed. The room smells of salt and paper and machine oil. Clock clicks louder than it should. Eleanor sketches a timeline that points backward into fog and forward into rumor. The coroner's preliminary notes read like a riddle in tidy ink, and Dr. Martin Hale said, no obvious trauma, no clear poison yet. Eleanor Ward listens for what is missing, and said, silence can be a design. Reed taps the page and said, we hold cause as undetermined. The air is chilled, and carries a faint antiseptic bite. Instruments rest obediently in their tray, and the body waits for answers that might have expired before dawn. Eleanor studies the lividity patterns and the relaxed mouth, wondering what last taste lingered. The clock hand moves with bureaucratic patience. Dr. Hale closes the folder with a sound that feels like a verdict, and said tests will speak or remain stubborn. Eleanor writes a single word, and circles it twice. Evening drapes the station in amber windows and long corridors, and Eleanor Ward said, he is a cipher wearing manners. Reed stands by the notice board where pins mark the city like pricks on a nerve and said, tomorrow we canvass hotels and trams. The day's notes stack into a tidy uncertainty. The witness statement is thin as a postcard, yet it trembles with the salt smell of fear. Eleanor rewinds each step until she hears the tide again, and she said, if he wrote a goodbye, it is small and hidden. A phone rings, stops, then rings again, refusing to bless anyone with certainty. Reed pockets his pen and said, no names to release. Night presses at the glass like a black watermark. Eleanor closes her notebook, and the room exhales. The suitcase waits in the lost property room like a secret wrapped in canvas, and Detective Thomas Reed said, checked in at the station baths, collected by no one. Eleanor Ward kneels beside it, her pencil tapping a rhythm, and she said, locks do not hide forever. The constable snaps the clasps, and the smell of mothballs exhales. Inside are clothes stitched with foreign thread, labels trimmed, patterns precise as codes. Reed said, Everything speaks, but nothing says who. Eleanor lifts a spool and whispers, English make, sold nowhere nearby. The suitcase becomes a map of a man erased stitch by stitch. The corridor hums with distant phones, while shadows stretch under the fluorescent glare. Eleanor presses her palm flat on the lining, sensing absence louder than presence. Garments spill onto the table, each tag cut clean, and Eleanor Ward said, "Who carries a wardrobe that forgets its maker?" Reed inspects a tie with surgical focus and said, "Imported, but no seller claims it." The constable mutters about irregular stitching while the clock in the hall ticks like a gavel. A sharp comb, a shaving brush, and thread spools rest like relics from another life. Eleanor touches the brush and said, "He cared for appearance as if it were armor." Reed sets the tie aside and said, "Then why cut away every origin?" The fluorescent bulb flickers as if nervous. A tram rattles outside, dragging the present against the past. Eleanor sketches the thread card with an arrow and circles it twice. At the coroner's office, Dr. Martin Hale adjusts spectacles as reports stack beside him, and he said, "No poison yet, though tests grope in the dark." Eleanor Ward listens as her pencil scratches, and she said, "Absence again, it repeats like a refrain." Reed crosses arms and said, "If he was poisoned, the dose left no signature." The sterile air smells of iodine and paper. Instruments wait in silver trays, their reflections cold as water. Eleanor stares at the samples labeled neat in glass vials and said, "Science hunts ghosts." Reed taps the folder once and mutters, "A ghost with polished shoes." Dr. Hale closes the report, the snap of the cover sounding like withheld judgment. The press hall roars with questions before anyone speaks, flashbulbs cracking like fireworks. Detective Thomas Reed raises his hand and said, "Cause of death is undetermined, identity unknown." Eleanor Ward stands near the wall, watching the frenzy consume its own echo. A reporter shouts, "Suicide or murder?" Reed replies with steel in his voice, "Neither confirmed." Eleanor scribbles, noting how silence breeds louder noise. A journalist whispers about spies, another about romance gone bitter. Margaret Doyle sits in the back, arms folded, shrinking into her cardigan. The air feels hot, thick with speculation. Eleanor said softly, "Mystery feeds on hunger." Night falls as Eleanor Ward sits alone at her desk, a stack of clippings beside her. She circles words like Tamam Shud scrawled in bold, and she said, a phrase ending, yet nothing ends. The lamp throws amber across her notes, casting shadows long as suspicion. The city hums outside, indifferent. Reed's voice lingers from memory. We hold back until we know. She studies the pattern of letters clipped from headlines, arranging them into a mock code. Her breath fogs the window as she stares into the black beyond, wondering if the answer waits offshore. A moth flutters against the lamp and dies with a faint hiss. Eleanor whispers, "He carried an ending in his pocket." The library archive smells of dust paper and old glue, a place where forgotten truths cling to shelves. Eleanor Ward said, "Every page here hides as much as it reveals." Detective Thomas Reed leaned over her notes and said, "The rubaiyat was no accident. Someone meant for us to find it." Sunlight slants through tall windows, dust dancing in golden shafts. Eleanor presses the book open, staring at the torn edge where the final page once lived. She said, "The missing leaf said, Tamam Shud. It means, finished, yet this story begins there." Reed frowns and said, "You think he carried it into death like a banner?" The librarian, cautious and silent, hovers nearby with a hand folded over her skirt. Eleanor underlines words with precision, each stroke deliberate. She said, "Verse made his last testimony, but in whose voice?" Silence settles over the oak tables, as though the room itself listened. The forensic lamp glows halo white over the desk, painting every mark in merciless clarity. Eleanor Ward said, "These are not random scratches. Look, columns, groups, repetition." Detective Thomas Reed leaned closer and said, "This is not verse, it's cipher." Faint letters scrawl like hesitant footsteps across the back page of the Rubaiyat, black ink pressed hard into paper. A lab technician adjusts a magnifier, murmuring, "War codes used less ink than this, still unsolved." Eleanor copies each line onto her pad, whispering as she draws. 5 clusters, no vowels, stutters and gaps. Reed taps the paper and said, "Espionage, or a delusion built carefully." The lab smells of solvent and stale air. The tick of the wall clock cuts the silence. Eleanor said, "Whatever it is, he carried words heavy enough to die with." Shadows stretch long on sterile tiles. The narrow Adelaide street hums with evening traffic as Eleanor Ward traces the curb where the car once waited. She said, "It's no coincidence it was left here, near the tram lines." Detective Thomas Reed scans the block and said, "Stationary, unclaimed, holding poetry like a time bomb." The asphalt glimmers faintly under fading sunlight, the season turning to dusk. A shopkeeper leans on his broom, watching them with narrowed eyes, and said, "That car sat for hours, driver never seen." Eleanor looks upward at rows of windows, each with perfect view of the spot. She said, "A stage chosen for witnesses." Reed scribbles in his notebook, his jaw tense. A dog barks in the distance, the sound sharp against the muted hum. Eleanor whispers, "The book was meant to be found, like a dropped breadcrumb." The wind pushes old newsprint along the gutter. The cafe's warmth crackles with gossip as Eleanor Ward stirs her coffee, watching steam curl upward. She said, "The cipher grows louder the more I copy it." Detective Thomas Reed folds his newspaper with deliberate care and said, "Front page hysteria, backroom silence." A headline screams of foreign spies hiding on the coast. At a nearby table, a student whispers of Russians and secret radios. The cafe smells of coffee and smoke, chatter overlapping like code. Eleanor sketches clusters again, columns of letters, marching. She said, "Language without a tongue, a voice without a speaker." Reed leans back weary and said, "The city wants spies. The truth wants patience." Outside trams rattle past, lights flashing across glass like Morse. Eleanor presses her pen hard, imprinting deep grooves in the paper. She said, "We are closer, yet it feels further away." Back in her apartment, Eleanor Ward pins cipher sheets to the wall in patterns, pages overlapping like broken maps. She said, "Each mark is a doorway with no key." The lamp's sepia glow stretches shadows across her desk, clippings stacked high. Outside, the city hums, indifferent. Reed's voice lingers in her head, spycraft or madness. She runs her fingertip along inked letters, as though they might rise and confess. The window pane fogs with her breath, her reflection staring back with tired eyes. She whispers, "Truth hides in persistence, not surrender." The clock strikes midnight, blunt as a hammer, echoing in the room. A moth flutters against the lamp and falls silent. Eleanor circles another sequence, her pencil breaking under pressure. She said softly, "The cipher waits, patient as stone, and I will wait longer." The rain thickens over Adelaide as Eleanor Ward waits at the railway station with her notes clutched tight. She said, "Each detail runs ahead like trains into darkness." Detective Thomas Reed steps beside her and said, "Answers hide where timetables break." The crowd moves around them, umbrellas snapping open like defenses. Eleanor scans faces, looking for the one who will not look back. A man in a grey hat lingers too long near the kiosk, eyes sharp then vanished. Reed mutters, "Too careful, too clean." Eleanor scribbles and whispers, "The keeper of secrets is here, not in plain sight, but close enough to touch." The train horn bellows, smearing voices into noise. She feels eyes upon her and knows this puzzle fights back. Inside a dim pub, Eleanor meets Harold Mason, the reluctant ally, who stirs his drink too long. Harold said, "I should not be here, this trail bites harder than you think." Eleanor answers, "Truth has already bitten me." His spectacles fog with the steam of wet coats, his hands trembling over the glass. Detective Thomas Reed sits at a distance, watching without words. Eleanor leans closer and said, "You know the patterns, radio code signals hidden in noise." Harold mutters, "I know enough to fear them." The pub crowd hums like static, voices blending into cover. Rain thuds against the windows, a metronome of unease. Harold's hesitation weighs heavier than the smoke, yet his presence feels like a door cracking open. In the archive basement, Eleanor studies coded pages with Harold Mason at her side. He whispers, "They read like shortwave transmissions." Eleanor said, "The seeker finds shape where others see noise." Harold shakes his head, nerves trembling, and said, "If I help, I burn bridges I cannot rebuild." Reed paces, his presence heavy as a verdict. Dust floats in beams of weak light. Eleanor marks repetition with her pencil, jaw clenched. She said, "Secrets demand oxygen. Starve them and they rot, but feed them and they grow." Harold sighs, rubbing his temples, his fear tangled with reluctant admiration. The clock ticks too loud in the basement silence. Eleanor feels his doubt but pushes anyway, because without him the trail fractures. The hidden enemy emerges smooth and charming, offering a file no one expected. Jonathan Blake said, "I want the truth too. Take this, it will help." Eleanor Ward studies his eyes and feels unease claw up her spine. Reed narrows his gaze and said, "Too eager for a friend." Jonathan smiles, his suit pressed immaculate, but his timing reeks of precision. Eleanor flips the folder open. Inside, documents point to places already disproven. She whispers, "A misstep meant to mislead." The room hums with tension, voices muffled in corridors beyond. Jonathan adjusts his cufflinks, confident, a mask polished for betrayal. Eleanor writes quietly, but her suspicion deepens into certainty. A late-night visit brings Eleanor to Mary Collins, the tragic figure, whose past knots into the Somerton case. Mary, frail but resolute, said, "I once knew a man who spoke of endings written in books." Eleanor listens, notebook closed, her gaze softening. Mary's room smells of medicine and wilted flowers, her hands clasped tight as though holding on to vanished years. Detective Thomas Reed waits in the doorway, silent. Mary's eyes glisten, haunted. She said, "He left words, but never his name." Eleanor said, "Your memory is a map, even if blurred." Mary lowers her gaze, tears brimming. The weight of her sorrow becomes another clue Eleanor cannot dismiss. The night beyond the window is ink, endless and watchful. The morgue's cold room hums as new tests are prepared on samples long preserved, bottles labeled in careful script. Dr. Martin Hale said unusual traces, but nothing conclusive yet. Eleanor Ward narrows her eyes and said, "A body that resists truth speaks louder than one that confesses." Detective Thomas Reed paces, his shoes echoing, and said, "If not poison, then what holds him silent?" Glass vials gleam under stark light, each like a fragment of a riddle. Hale sighs, glasses fogging faintly. Science finds whispers, not answers. Eleanor writes with steady hand, words etched hard. His death is an equation without sum. The silence grows so deep. The hum of the refrigeration feels like a pulse. At twilight, Eleanor meets the mysterious outsider on a park bench, rain dripping from the branches. A tall stranger said, "Not all codes are written for the living." Eleanor answers, "Yet they trap the living in endless chase." His fedora shadows his eyes, but his voice cuts sharp. Reed watches from a distance, arms folded, a silhouette in lamplight. Samuel whispers, "Look to the missing, not the found. What vanishes leaves the deepest mark." Eleanor presses, "Why tell me this now?" He smiles thin and sad, "Because you've already crossed the threshold." The lamplight flickers, and he rises, vanishing into misty paths before more can be asked. Eleanor grips her pencil so tight it snaps in two. Betrayal bleeds into the investigation when Jonathan Blake returns with new directions. Jonathan, smooth as ever, said, "I've traced a link you missed." Eleanor studies him, doubt sharp in her eyes, and said, "You bring answers too quickly." He spreads maps across the table, pointing with a deliberate finger. Reed growls. Why now, when the trail grows thin? Jonathan smirks. Sometimes timing is survival. The papers mark docks, warehouses, coded initials scrawl. Eleanor whispers, misdirection painted as guidance. Jonathan shrugs, his confidence unshaken. The tension coils like wire, Reed's hand hovering near his pocket watch as if to ground himself. Eleanor feels trust collapse in slow fragments, leaving only suspicion. The victim's story edges closer as Eleanor meets Mary Collins again. Mary, said he once spoke of enemies who never forgive. Eleanor listens, patient, her notes untouched, and said, you carry a piece of his silence. Mary clutches a locket at her chest, trembling, eyes wet with grief. Reed stands nearby, hands behind his back, gaze softened by empathy he rarely shows. Mary whispers he feared shadows more than death. They followed him even in dreams. Eleanor leans closer, her tone low, and those dreams ended on the sand. The air feels heavy, the room too small for sorrow this wide. Mary lowers her head, whispering, if he left me anything, it was the weight of what cannot be spoken. Back in her study, Eleanor pins fresh notes across her wall, now layered thick with clippings and cipher fragments. She said, the picture grows larger, but never whole. Reed enters quietly, his footsteps soft, and said, each answer breeds more shadows. The air smells of ink and rain-soaked wood. Eleanor stares at the lattice of papers, circles and arrows like veins of obsession. She whispers, I see betrayal, grief and silence, but the root hides deeper. Reed mutters, every witness speaks as if gagged. The city's lights flicker beyond the window, the sound of a late tram drifting. Eleanor presses her palm against the paper and said, the truth resists me, but it cannot outlast me. Her eyes shine with resolve and exhaustion, equal weights dragging her forward. The storm rattles Adelaide's skyline as Eleanor Ward and Detective Thomas Reed face the keeper of secrets inside a government office cloaked in silence. The official, Edward Langley, said, some truths must remain buried. Eleanor's voice sharpens, burial is not justice, it is cowardice. Reed stands firm beside her, his jaw tight. Langley's calm expression cracks for a breath before he smooths it again. He said, you chase shadows that serve no one. Eleanor leans forward, her pencil digging into paper, and said, shadows have roots, and they grow in soil you guard. The ticking of a wall clock carves the air. Rain streaks the tall window, blurring the city beyond. Eleanor feels the fight shift into open war. The air thickens as Jonathan Blake, the hidden enemy, is dragged into interrogation. Jonathan said, you think me a traitor? I walked beside you for answers. Eleanor Ward slams down his false files and said, you walked beside us to mislead. Reed's shadow stretches long across the floor, his voice cold, you gambled with the truth. Jonathan smirks, cufflinks gleaming even under harsh light. He said every investigator needs misdirection. It keeps the real hunters safe. Eleanor leans across the table, her tone steady but fire-edged, and now you burn in the lies you spun. The overhead lamp buzzes, its light too sharp. Jonathan's mask falters for a flicker, his smirk bending toward fear. Candlelight flickers in Harold Mason's study, as he finally sides with Eleanor. Harold said, I feared too long, but silence has cost me more. Eleanor nods, eyes tired but fierce. Then speak now, while there is still a chance. He opens his locked drawer, producing coded radio logs, yellowed with years. Reed leans forward, reading quickly, and said, these call signs match the scribbles in the Rubaiyat. Harold shakes, sweat gleaming on his temple. These transmissions were never meant to surface. Eleanor whispers, and yet they will. The clock ticks heavy on the mantel, each second a reminder that they move against the tide. Harold presses the papers into Eleanor's hands like a confession. Mary Collins sits pale by her window, her voice quaking with the weight of memory. Mary said, he feared a name more than death, one whispered like a curse. Eleanor listens with pen, paused, gaze soft. Reed asks gently, Whose name? Mary shakes her head, eyes wet. I cannot say it, not even now. Her hands clutch the locket tighter, knuckles white. Eleanor whispers, your silence feeds the fire they set. Mary's tears spill, trembling as she said, he trusted me with nothing but his absence. The curtains flutter with night wind, carrying the smell of rain. Reed exchanges a look with Eleanor. Grief feels heavier than proof. The room holds its sorrow like a sealed tomb. The confrontation sharpens as Eleanor spreads the cipher notes and heralds logs across her apartment wall, the patterns aligning at last. She said, the keeper's silence cracks here. Reed steps beside her, eyes scanning the lattice of letters, and said, this is no longer theory. It breathes like design. Thunder rattles the glass, rain striking hard. Eleanor circles sequences with thick strokes, her voice shaking. He was a carrier, a vessel for words meant to vanish. Reed mutters, and those who guarded it now guard nothing. The papers ripple in the storm's draft, shadows dancing like phantoms. Eleanor whispers, we have unmasked them, but the cost lies waiting. She stands unflinching, eyes burning with truth's weight. The storm fades into a bruised dawn as Eleanor Ward pins the final cipher solution to her wall. She whispers, it is not code. It is names buried in fragments. Detective Thomas Reed exhales, the sound heavy with years of waiting. He said, so many lost voices bound in silence until now. Eleanor traces each cluster with trembling fingers, her eyes tired yet relentless. Outside, gulls circle the coast as the city begins its indifferent routines. The evidence breathes like a ghost given shape, yet the story remains fractured. Reed mutters, it explains his death, but not who he truly was. Eleanor writes across the page in thick strokes, identity erased, but truth refuses burial. The morning feels hollow, both victory and defeat pressing on their shoulders. In the government chamber, Edward Langley faces Eleanor and Reed, his mask fractured. Edward said, you meddled where silence was safer. Eleanor's reply is steel. Safer for whom? His hands tremble though his voice holds weight. A dead man keeps a nation from burning. Reed steps forward, voice low but firm. The dead deserve truth, not usefulness. Langley's gaze falters, the storm of power cracking at last. Eleanor lays coded logs across his desk, each page a nail in the coffin of secrecy. She said, your control dies with exposure. The room grows colder, silence stretching until it crushes. Langley lowers his eyes, the truth pried from his grip, yet victory tastes bitter. Jonathan Blake sits in his cell, the smirk gone, shadows pooled under his eyes. Jonathan mutters, I played the game too well and lost. Eleanor Ward watches from the other side of the bars, voice low, deception burns its owner first. Reed lingers in the background, silent, but unyielding. Jonathan grips the bars with white knuckles, his cufflinks long gone, replaced by shackles of shame. He spits, the truth changes nothing, he is still nameless. Eleanor answers, no name does not mean no story. The cell is damp, heavy with despair, the sound of dripping echoing like a metronome. Jonathan slumps, his last defiance cracked open into silence. Reed closes the ledger and walks away. Mary Collins stands at the beach, her hair tangled by salt wind, the sea endless before her. Mary said, this is where he ended, though not where he belonged. Eleanor Ward beside her said softly, he belonged to no place because secrets stole him. Reed stands further back, coat flapping in the breeze, watching the tide erase footprints. Mary clutches her locket, tears slipping as she whispers, I will carry him where the waves cannot. Eleanor's eyes soften, her pen quiet. The sea hisses like a voice unbroken. The horizon glows faintly under pale sun, yet no answers drift from its edge. Their silence joins the roar of surf, a requiem without resolution. That night, Eleanor Ward sits alone in her study, the wall of papers casting long shadows. She whispers, we have unearthed threads, but not the fabric. Reed's voice lingers from memory. Justice is not always truth. The city hums outside, oblivious. Eleanor closes her notebook, her pencil rolling to the floor. She gazes at the pinned fragments, each clue now heavy with finality. Her reflection in the window looks older, worn by secrets too vast. She whispers again. The mystery breathes still, unfinished. The rubaiyat lies closed on her desk, the words Tamam Shud etched in her mind. The lamp flickers, darkness pressing at the edges, a reminder that some stories never truly end.